The Man Who Always Took the Same Road Home by me. At 2:13 in the morning, Daniel Mercer missed his turn. This was remarkable for two reasons. First, Daniel had been driving professionally for 23 years. Second, he'd taken this particular road home 5 nights a week for almost 11 of them. County Road 16. Left at the abandoned feed mill, 8 miles through farmland, right at the water tower. Home. He could have driven it asleep, which his daughter occasionally reminded him was not something a truck driver should say. But tonight, Daniel drove straight past the feed mill. He didn't realize it until the GPS spoke, recalculating. Daniel looked at the screen. What? The blue line had changed. Instead of telling him to turn around, it continued north along a gray road and promised to get him home only 6 minutes later. Daniel frowned. Or thought he did. Snow had begun tapping softly against the windshield. Not enough to worry about, but enough that backing a 40-foot straight truck down some county road at 2 in the morning sounded considerably less appealing than 6 extra minutes. Fine. He followed the blue line. 3 miles later, Daniel saw the lights. A green highway sign appeared first. Linden, 1 mile. Daniel stared at it as he passed. Linden? He'd never heard of Linden. That bothered him. He delivered heating oil, lubricants, propane, fertilizer, and just about everything else a person could haul around this part of the state. He knew towns consisting of 4 houses and a grain elevator. Yet apparently there was an entire town 6 miles from his normal route that he'd somehow missed for 11 years. He slowed. A church steeple appeared beyond the trees, then houses, then a gas station with 2 pumps that looked considerably older than Daniel, and finally a diner, the Linden House. The open sign glowed red in the window. Daniel glanced at the clock. 2:22 a.m. Sure, why not? He hadn't eaten since noon. A bell jingled when he opened the door. The place smelled like coffee, bacon, and something sweet baking in the oven. There were 12 stools along the counter, 6 booths, an old jukebox, and precisely 1 other human being. An elderly woman stood behind the counter. She looked up from the book she was reading. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then she smiled. Well, I'll be damned. Daniel stopped. Excuse me? The woman closed her book. You've got his eyes. Daniel looked behind himself. There was nobody there. My eyes? And that same confused look whenever somebody says something he doesn't understand. She laughed. Daniel didn't. I'm sorry. Do I know you? No. She reached for a coffee cup. But I knew your grandfather. Daniel felt something move through his chest. My grandfather? Eric. The room suddenly seemed very quiet. Daniel's grandfather had been dead for 17 years. Eric Mercer? The woman poured coffee. Eric Lindstrom before his father decided Mercer would make life easier. Daniel stared at her. Almost nobody knew that. His mother did. His aunt probably did. Daniel himself hadn't learned it until he was nearly 30. The woman slid the coffee toward him. Sit down, Daniel. He didn't. How do you know my name? She pointed toward the breast of his work jacket. Daniel looked down. Daniel. Oh. The woman grinned. Disappointing, isn't it? Despite himself, Daniel laughed. A little. Sit. This time he did. She placed a slice of pie in front of him. I didn't order that. I know. What kind? Blackberry? Daniel looked at her again. You've got to be kidding me. What? My grandfather loved blackberries. Your grandfather loved anything containing enough sugar to kill a horse. Daniel laughed. And for the next 40 minutes, an 82-year-old woman named Ruth told Daniel stories about his grandfather he'd never heard. Eric dancing terribly. Eric getting his first truck stuck in a drainage ditch. Eric teaching Ruth's younger brother how to drive. Eric, before he'd pull away, he'd put both hands on that big steering wheel and tap it twice. Every single time. Never knew why. Daniel goes completely quiet. because he does that too. Then Ruth told him something else. Your grandfather used to sit exactly where you're sitting. Daniel looked down at the stool. He was a driver? Most of his life. I mean, he'd come in here after driving, usually when something was bothering him. Daniel became still. Ruth wiped the counter. He'd sit there drinking coffee and complaining that everyone else seemed to know where their life was going except him. Daniel smiled faintly. That doesn't sound like him. That's because you knew him after he'd figured some things out. Something about that sentence landed harder than Daniel expected. Outside, the snow continued falling. Daniel stared through the window at his truck. I don't know where mine is going. Ruth didn't answer immediately. That surprised him. Most people did. They told you everything would work out. They told you to be grateful. They told you what they'd do if they were you. Ruth merely refilled his coffee. Finally, she said, Maybe that's because you keep taking the same road home. Daniel looked at her. She shrugged. I'm 82. Occasionally, we're allowed to say things that sound profound. He laughed. But Ruth wasn't laughing anymore. You spend your whole life delivering things where they're supposed to go, Daniel. Maybe it's worth asking where you're supposed to go. Daniel stared at the coffee. There were things he'd wanted, things he'd dismissed, places he'd imagined living, work he'd imagined doing, stories he'd imagined telling, a life he'd kept postponing because there was always another bill, another shift, another sensible reason to wait. When did my grandfather figure it out? Ruth smiled. He didn't. Daniel frowned. You just said, I said he'd figured some things out. Nobody figures it out. She leaned against the counter. Eric just stopped requiring certainty before he'd move. For some reason, Daniel felt his eyes beginning to burn. So he looked toward the window. Snow's picking up, Ruth nodded. Then you should probably get going. Daniel pulled out his wallet. How much? I already paid. By who? Me, Ruth. Consider it a repayment. For what? She smiled. Your grandfather pulled my husband's car out of a snowbank in 1978. Daniel laughed. That's a hell of a long tab. I've been patient. Daniel got back in his truck, sat, looked out the windshield, put his hands up on the steering wheel, tapped it twice. He smiled. The snow stopped 10 minutes after Daniel left Linden. His GPS brought him home exactly as promised. 6 minutes later than usual. Before going inside, Daniel sat in his driveway. He opened his phone. For years there had been a place he'd wanted to see. He looked at pictures, watched videos, learned pieces of the language, then talked himself out of it. Too expensive, too complicated, too late. Daniel opened the airline app. He didn't buy anything. Not yet. He simply looked, and for the first time, looking didn't feel like dreaming. It felt like planning. 3 weeks later, Daniel tried to find the diner again. He wanted to bring Ruth something. He took County Road 16, past the feed mill, then deliberately continued straight. He found the narrow road. He found the church. He found the gas station. And he found Linden. Of course he did. Daniel laughed at himself for having wondered otherwise. There was no disappearing town, no ghost diner, no magical road. The Linden house was exactly where he'd left it, except the open sign was dark. A handwritten note was taped inside the window. Closed Wednesdays. Daniel checked his phone. Wednesday. Of course. He laughed. Then he noticed something underneath the sign. A photograph. Old and faded. 5 young people stood beside a truck. Daniel recognized Ruth immediately, and beside her was a skinny young man with his arm resting on the hood. Daniel stepped closer. His grandfather. Eric. Probably 20 years old. Daniel smiled. Then he noticed the writing beneath the photograph. He couldn't read most of it. Swedish. But there were 2 words he understood. Vägenem. Daniel pulled out his phone and translated them anyway. He stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he looked back at the photograph. The road home. Daniel stood there smiling until the screen of his phone went dark. And somewhere behind him, on the highway he'd driven for 11 years without ever wondering what lay beyond his turn, a truck continued north.